kind of on short notice here.
Not a problem.
You're probably busy. I'll just get into it. Yeah.
Okay.
Here, let me pin this here. And all right.
Recording in progress.
Okay. I'll just ask you to introduce yourself to start us off here.
I am Raywat Deonandan, Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist and associate professor, Faculty of Health Sciences, University of Ottawa.
So I just wonder, first of all, just what are your thoughts as you see across the country? Different provinces, school boards are coming up with plans for back to school, and I guess what are some of the things that you're looking for in those plans?
First thought is, wow, we're so late in the game, and some places are still putting together their plans. They should have been on the books back in May when we asked for these plans to be put into place. Second is that I'm glad to see that pretty much everybody's on board with aerosol containment. COVID is airborne, and now most experts are agreeing to this. That changes the situation substantially. An aerosol disease spreads more easily and requires a high-quality mask and, most importantly, ventilation to control its spread. And I know, some school boards were resistant to that information, I suspect because improvements in ventilation are costly, and no one wants to make them. Some schools have windows that are painted shut, for example. You can't open the windows. That's crazy. I like to think of this as an opportunity to accelerate infrastructural investments in schools that were needed anyway, that will pay dividends for years down the road. So pretty high cost up front, but a great return on investment over the next few years. So it's great that we're doing this. It's a little late in the game for many school boards to enact sufficient, substantial ventilation improvements. So what does that leave us? It leaves us with some other tools: masking, public health assets, and vaccination. So I don't think any province yet has mandated vaccination for education workers. I think there's some whispering going on. It'll happen at some point. I think that's kind of important to maximize vaccination of all the adults, because those under 12 cannot be vaccinated and thus constitute a large susceptible population. This pandemic right now is raging through the unvaccinated, and the single largest contiguous block of unvaccinated people are kids under 12. So they have to be protected with wraparound services. Those kids between 12 and 19, the uptake of vaccines has not been as high as it could be. Therefore, I do expect some outbreaks in that population starting in the fall as well. So I'm giving a lot of information at once.
Yeah, no, that's good. I just want to back you up then.
Sure.
The fact that we understand now so much more about the aerosol spread of COVID, that is some information we didn't have. Like PEI, we went back to school last September. We didn't understand that as well as we do now. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, experts last year knew it. It wasn't getting sufficient penetration to decision makers. So it was a bit of an uphill climb getting that information across. But now it's fairly well understood that that's probably what's happening. And Delta is a new beast. So Delta might be the most contagious respiratory virus we've seen in many years, maybe ever. So it kind of changes the scenario a bit here. Maybe you haven't heard that before, but Delta is crazy contagious, maybe as contagious as chickenpox. Probably not, frankly, but pretty contagious. So controlling ventilation is important. Reducing class sizes is important as well. In the event of an outbreak, then you can take that unit, that cohort, out of rotation and not inconvenience the rest of the school population. So that's where the management and the public health assets matter, the testing, the ability to isolate, and so forth. Symptom checks are important. If you're symptomatic, you're much more likely to be spreading the virus. What is that? The thing is that a lot of kids are going to have sniffles, are going to have symptoms that aren't COVID, and they're going to be pulled out of the population. So there's going to be some chaos here, no matter how we play this. And there has to be some accommodation for kids who are pulled out of the system for whatever reason. What are the distance learning options here? So there is no ideal way forward. But a cheap, effective, easily applied tool is the masks. I think we should be giving free N95 masks to children across the board. It's cheaper.
Should that mask mandate continue into the coming school year? Like we did have one here in PEI, yeah.
I think it should, yes, absolutely. Because it's the last great protective measure. But again, really cheap, probably quite impactful. Let's say it isn't impactful. What did it cost you? On the whole, pennies per mask at the population level. but it probably does lower transmission substantially, especially in an aerosol environment. Right, so not the cloth mask, the actual N95 respirator masks. So we all get used to wearing those, regularly. It would help enormously. The goal here, because Delta is so transmissible, and because this population can't be vaccinated, the goal is to lower the reproduction number artificially to achieve something resembling effective herd immunity while we explore vaccination. And we artificially reduce the reproduction number by limiting the opportunities for infection. That means mask wearing, distancing, small class sizes, etc., etc., etc.
What are we learning as we watch in the United States as the Delta goes through their school systems?
We're learning it's no joke. We're also learning that even though a small proportion of kids will become infected and a small proportion of those infected will be hospitalized, a small percentage of a large number is a large number. So what's different this time around is Delta. Delta rips through unvaccinated populations. So let's say it rips through our child population. Most will be just fine, but that tiny proportion of this large number now means a fairly high number of hospitalized kids. That's deeply worrying. So I've seen some modeling suggesting an attack rate of 70% amongst unvaccinated kids, which means 70% of kids can expect to be infected some point during the school year. And let's say 1% of those end up hospitalized. That's a fair number. And by that 1% is what we're seeing in the US right now. 1% of infections end up hospitalized in the pediatric population. And a third of those who are hospitalized require ICU care. And a handful of those will die. This is serious stuff. So we have to do everything we can to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just talking to a Prince Edward Islander who was hoping to see other aspects of life get even closer to normal this fall. But as you're describing what we ought to be doing in schools, it's nothing like that.
Yeah, like I thought we'd be approaching normal this fall as well last June, but what changed was Delta changed everything, and the vaccine uptake was not as quick as I had hoped. By the way, if 100% of people get vaccinated now, this is done. We are done. But that's not going to happen. So while we wait for vaccination to be accepted, we have to deploy these other tools. Now, the number one way to keep COVID out of schools, the number one way is to keep it out of the community. If it's not in the neighborhood of the schools, it can't get into the schools. And the way you do that is by having these other public health tools in place. But most importantly, you make sure that all of the adults in that community are vaccinated to the extent they can be. So in Ontario, they are planning to have vaccination clinics near and around schools to encourage and cajole people who haven't been vaccinated to accept their shots. That's good. So we have to do everything we can to make the community as resilient as possible so that the school becomes resilient.
Now, we have been told we're one of those jurisdictions. We're still waiting for the back to school plan in PEI. What I have been told from our main English language school board is that there will be no mandate, no requirement that teachers be vaccinated. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And given that, if there's other precautions you think need to be in the plan then.
This is being framed as a civil liberties issue where our rights to bodily integrity are sacrosanct. And it's interesting it's not being framed as a public health issue where our rights to a safe society are not sacrosanct. We have precedent already where the state controls our bodies. I'm not allowed to inject heroin into my veins. I'm not allowed to sell my blood or organs. And that's because control over my body has been enacted for the greater public good. Vaccination is in that category where the state can enact some degree of control over our bodies for the greater public good. Now, I'm not saying people should be held down and vaccinated. I'm saying some professions should mandate vaccination because no one has a constitutional right to a particular job. They have a constitutional right to the integrity and autonomy of their bodies, but not to their job. So if you don't want the jab, get another job, is my philosophy. Now, there's going to be some people who cannot be vaccinated for medical purposes, a tiny proportion, for reasons having to do with being allergic to the vaccine ingredients, for example. For them, we can accommodate. We can compel them to test regularly to make sure they're not carrying infection. We can't do that for a large number of people. It's too expensive, it's too cumbersome. But for a handful, we can. But my feeling is, I think a handful of professions should be compelled to be vaccinated because these are front-facing professions that deal with a large number of people. healthcare workers, first responders, educators. You know, that includes me as an educator. I should be compelled to be vaccinated. It's not. I mean, it's not an unpopular position, but somehow we've given disproportionate voice to those who are opposed to it. But the majority of Canadians feel as I do, I think. Um, there's no easy way, there's no way through this that satisfies all of the civil liberties concerns. Someone's going to have to compromise their desires. And I think from the lens of what is best for public health, it should be the individual who compromises in this case.
Right. But if they're not requiring teachers to be vaccinated, are there any other precautions you think should be there
Yeah.
for kids, for families, where they have concerns?
Well, symptom checks are important for everyone involved. Um, and being aware of what the symptoms are, because the symptoms for Delta are different than COVID Classic, and the symptoms for vaccinated people are different from unvaccinated. We also need to do some surveillance. That means deploying some rapid tests on a regular basis. The rapid tests aren't perfect, they have a high false negative rate, but the way you get around that is to test people multiple times throughout the week. And that way we have a very small proportion of false negatives. And the second you test positive, you can take that to the bank. You're positive, you take it out of circulation. If you're negative, you keep on going to class. So that's one tool. That's one of the many public health tools we have here. Screening, surveillance, test, trace, and isolate. Yeah. And of course, to continue to cajole and encourage vaccination.
And just one thing, because you mentioned this early on, is it was one of your key points around ventilation systems and having the proper systems in place. I know we have I think it's 56 English schools in PEI. 10 of them do not have modern HVAC systems. So they're supposed to open their windows every day, flush the air out multiple times a day. I know I have been sort of pestering the Department of Education on this issue because there have been all these published reports, experts calling for improved ventilation systems because otherwise there's an increased risk, I guess, of COVID within those spaces that aren't properly ventilated. The province's response through most of this year has been, this is not a concern for us because COVID does not spread through ventilation systems.
Wow.
It's a response that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, that's some old information. There's some studies suggesting it does spread through ventilation systems. Like cruise lines are a good example of this. Outbreaks on cruise ships where people are sealed in their rooms and yet getting infected. How? Because it came through the vents. There's no other way. So
okay, so with or without ventilation, but I mean, you're calling for them to make improvements, and
right.
That would be a key in these buildings where we don't have any ventilation systems.
Yes, and now I understand it's expensive and problematic, especially in a 2 or 3 week time frame. And other ways around this, there's some studies looked at portable air purifiers in key choke points in buildings that seem to do a lot of good. So you can invest in several $100s per unit around a building, and that's a good makeshift way. I mean, that's an engineering question. I'm out of my expertise there, but some studies have shown that there are temporary solutions in place. Opening a window is good, but when it gets really cold, what are you going to do? Yeah.
Invest the money, and that was that was kind of what you said. Invest the money and update your ventilation system.
That's right. But at this point, it's going to take several weeks to do difficult, invasive upgrades in an old building. There may not be enough time at this point, so you're better off buying or renting portable purification systems. And then, in a couple months, 3-4 months possibly, vaccination for children become available. And then we're in a whole different world.
All right. I always appreciate your insight on things. Thank you so much, Raywat.
Great. Bye-bye.
Great. Have a good one.
Recording stopped.